In the past, I had made a video about Nintendo's Lite consoles, and it got me to thinking about Nintendo's Pro consoles and how they handle it quite differently compared to their... in the past, I would have said competitors, but let's be honest, nowadays, Nintendo is off completely doing their own thing. They are completely outside and away from the console wars, and if we're gonna be honest with this generation, and I'd say even the last generation, the console wars really just don't exist anymore. If you're still out there fighting the console wars, I'm not trying to insult you or your intelligence here, but you're kind of a goofy dum-dum head, okay? So when you think about Pro consoles, I mean, honestly, the idea of Pro consoles in itself is still kind of a new concept, but not really, because Nintendo's actually been doing this for decades, and we're gonna get to that. So when you think about Pro consoles, you have like the PlayStation 4 Pro, the Xbox One X, and you know, console revisions have always been a thing, but console revisions never necessarily meant, oh, you're gonna get a boost in power. Like you had the SNES, which had a slight revision, which kind of slimmed down the console. You have the PlayStation, which then had like the PS1, which was like a, you know, a slimmer version of that. You have the PS2 Slim, the PS3 Slim, the PS4 Slim, the Xbox One S, the 360 Slim. List goes on and on. But really, only within the last decade have we started to see Pro consoles become kind of the norm again with the PS4 Pro, the Xbox One X, and we're assuming there is a PS5 Pro up the pipeline if the leaks are to be believed. You guys know me, I don't pay attention to leaks or rumors. I only know about this stuff because it ends up crossing my radar because I have a second channel where I cover gaming news on a weekly basis, as well as the fact as being a YouTuber and I watch a lot of gaming content, my recommended ends up getting flooded with that garbage because in my opinion, leaks and rumors are really just garbage. I hate paying attention to that stuff. It's really just a waste of time. When the official sources are ready to announce that stuff, they'll announce it. When they're ready to release it, they'll release it. It's as simple as that. Anytime that I get one of those leaks and rumors channels in my recommended, I'm gonna be honest, I hate saying this and admitting that, but I honestly just go down and click don't recommend channel. Just I couldn't be bothered. And as far as Microsoft goes this generation, I don't know if we're actually gonna see a Pro console from them because we already have the Series X and we already have the Series S, and I feel like if you're trying to make a Pro console on top of that, I mean, not only are the different SKUs maybe going to get a little confusing there for the general consumer, because, you know, you got to keep that in mind. When it comes to the internet, everybody thinks that, oh, their opinion is so grand and important, but dude, the internet is like the smallest fraction of society. The mass or general or popular opinion on the internet is typically either the exact opposite or couldn't be further from how, like, the general population feels. Either that or it just doesn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. And honestly, even when it comes to the internet itself, none of this stuff even matters in the grand scheme of things. Y'all are just I'd say wasting your breath, but I'd rather it's just wasting your time being keyboard warriors. But hey, people are happy doing that. Anyway, I got way off track there. Sorry, I have feelings about things. Could you tell? So who knows what Microsoft's plans are? You know, that they might pull a Xbox 360 and start the new generation before PlayStation. Who even knows? But anyway, getting back on track here with Nintendo, they have never really done Pro systems like that until the Nintendo Switch. And this is a funny situation because there wasn't much of a spec bump, but there kind of was too. So in terms of like CPU, GPU, RAM, like, it's all the exact same. But when it comes to the actual hardware itself, there was a lot of quality of life improvements. Like for example, the kickstand on the back of the Switch, like it's an actual kickstand that's worth a dang now, and not just like a flimsy little thing that you also see on like a Five Below phone case. You know what I'm talking about. You've bought those Five Below phone cases at least once that are advertised as coming with a kickstand, but then the kickstand either completely breaks off like mine did right here, where literally just I tried to open it and it ripped off. Either that or it doesn't even hold the phone up. So yeah, thankfully we got some nice quality of life improvements in terms of the hardware there, but also in terms of software, the internal storage was also bumped up to 64 gigabytes, which was very welcome considering how large and massive the Switch library is, where even if you're a physical collector like me, there's a lot of games that either require downloads anyway, or whether that be DLC, like, you know, first example that comes to mind is like, you know, Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. You buy the game, and while all the stuff is there on the cartridge, and you only have to worry about some update data, if you want the DLC for that game, which, yeah, you need to get the DLC for Kingdom Battle, well, you don't need to, but I'd highly recommend it, because it lets you play as Donkey Kong in a completely separate campaign, and that separate campaign in itself is long enough to, I'd say, qualify as like a game in itself. Yeah, so, you know, you want to get that DLC and make sure you have storage for that, and with how many games were released with DLC, especially from Nintendo in the last generation, which I feel like that could be in a video in itself, talking about Nintendo's live service games, I put in heavy quotes because it's like they're trying to do live service, but they're not. And Nintendo does that from time to time where they want to experiment with something new, with something popular, or just kind of dabble their toes in something. But they go half in and half out, and they like kind of do it, kind of don't. But the one thing with Nintendo is that more times than not, when they do that, they end up supporting it long term with, again, while putting their own Nintendo twist on it. So it's like, all right, you know what, you can kind of forgive it. Like the whole amiibo thing, they didn't go all in like say Skylanders or Disney Infinity did, to where, you know, you will lock characters in game or there's a lot of actual substantial content locked behind it. Sometimes there is, like with Skyward Sword HD being one of my favorite examples to go to, where it's like, all right, there's actually some really huge quality of life improvements locked behind that amiibo. But otherwise, for the most part, it's on a game-to-game basis, but there was a lot of widespread support for the amiibo across various consoles and games. And I mean, hey, the amiibo have been around for what, like almost, if not a decade at this point, and they're still being supported. So again, Nintendo, they didn't go full in like Skylanders or Disney Infinity did, but they're still supporting it almost a decade later, whereas Skylanders and Disney Infinity, yeah, you can buy this for like $1 on eBay, which I'm not gonna lie, yeah, I've actually started collecting some Skylanders and Disney Infinity in recent years, because it's fun! LEGO Dimensions is one of my favorite Toys to Life games, if I'm gonna be honest. It's just, it's so cool. There was so much, like, so much fun, like, DLC that was released for that game, genuinely underrated. But then the other obvious enhancement there with the Nintendo Switch was the OLED screen, because while the Switch, for me personally, the Switch is more of a console, just because that's how I use the system. For some people, it's going to be more of a handheld. It just depends on how you find yourself using the system more. I do kind of get into the hybrid thing with it sometimes, or like sometimes I'll play it in handheld, because I do play Pokemon Cafe Remix. That's just one of my favorite like chill out type of games when it's been a long day and I just want to turn my brain off, 10, 15, 30 minutes, something like that, just get on, do my thing, you know. So I will play the game, or play the device in handheld mode for that, because that's the only way that you can play that game, unfortunately, which, that's kind of okay. It leads into the satisfaction factor of, like, swinging around all the Pokemon on the screen and stuff, but, yeah, so, you know, I'll play it like that, but for the most part, it's more or less just a console for me. But considering the fact that it is a hybrid system, and that's part of the Switch name, you know, switching back and forth, switching up the way you play, that OLED screen is really nice. Now, I have gone on record before saying this, that I prefer LCD screens, and that is just for one specific, well, actually two specific reasons. One, for some reason, I just really like the way that LCDs look. I don't know what it is. It might be a nostalgia thing. I just kind of, I don't know. There's something about that LCD look that I don't know. I love it. I mean, I don't know. It's the same thing as CRTs, right? Because the first TV that I had for the first however many years of my life was a CRT. And then by the time I was like 6 years old, I want to say, is when LCD started to be more widely adopted. 6, 7 years old, something like that. So then my family ended up getting one. Then it was like a 28 or a 32 inch or something like that. And it was one of those ones that had like a built-in DVD player in it. So that was pretty cool. And yeah, I've always just loved that LCD look. OLEDs look great, of course, but the second reason, which is the more important reason here, is that there's something wrong with my eyes or my head or something, I guess, to where OLEDs just kind of make my eyes tired, sometimes almost give me a headache or just make me feel drained after using them. I'm not sure if there's like a phenomenon for that, if anybody else has ever experienced that, but yeah, so even when I'm playing on my Switch, like, I can play it for a substantial amount of time, but afterwards I do kind of feel my eyes going like, whoa, man, like, I never play any of my devices with the brightness too high either. I'm the type of guy where usually my phone screen is so dim that people have to take it from me and turn up the brightness, but it's, you know, it's just dim enough to where I don't have to strain my eyes to see it. It's, like, just right for my old eyes. But, yeah, maybe that's one of those things where I just need to build up a tolerance over time, but for the mass population, I'd say that the OLED screen was a nice upgrade there for the Nintendo Switch OLED. But outside of that, again, when it comes to specs and spec bumps, that was really the extent of it. It was mostly just hardware-based stuff, and actually, now that I'm thinking of it, yeah, there was no software, or, I mean, well, you know, when it comes to these Pro consoles, it's never really software improvements anyway. It's always hardware, but, like, you know, it's like hardware that isn't spec-related. So, yeah, you know, that's basically all that they did for their first and really only Pro home console. But that's where things get interesting with Nintendo, because again, while I mentioned before that the Pro console is more of a newer idea, more of a new thing in the gaming industry, Nintendo's actually been doing this for a really long time, longer than you may have even expected. So I'm going to take you guys all the way back to the 1990s, which really wasn't that long ago, if we're being honest. Unfortunately, I missed the 90s. I was born right at the turn of the century, but hey, you know, it's close enough. So, I mean, you know, it's for some people, it's still been a substantial amount of time, but for me, I say what you, I'm just trying to cope. Time's going fast, man. I'm getting old. But originally, obviously, we had the Game Boy, and then the Game Boy, man, that handheld lived for a very long time, longer than the Nintendo Switch. Everybody's like, oh, we need the Switch too. Switch has had such a long life cycle. Dude, if you were there for the Game Boy, again, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but like, I mean, it was there for a long time. And then we had the whole Pokemon boom, which basically gave it like a second life there. But then we got the Game Boy Color, which you may be like, no, Grotesque, that is the Game Boy 2, or it's like the successor to it. No, it is not, according to Nintendo anyway, so this has always been a bit of a fun conversation piece, I guess, in my mind, because Nintendo always looked at the Game Boy Color as being it's sort of like how they were trying to market the DS at first, right? Because the DS, they were always like, no, this isn't replacing the Game Boy Advance, this is our third pillar, along with, like, you know, the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance and all of that. You know, the DS, it's a third pillar. And that's kind of how they were doing the Game Boy Color. They were like, no, this is another pillar. This is just another version of the Game Boy. Keep buying our normal Game Boys too. But really, if you look at it, if you look at the libraries, there were so many exclusive games to where it's like, personally, I would say that the Game Boy Color was like the Game Boy 2, and the Game Boy Advance would have been like the Game Boy 3. Again, Nintendo looks at the Game Boy Advance as being the Game Boy 2, and the Game Boy / Color being just one console. But again, that's just how I'm gonna look at it, because if you look at it, like, there's so many games that are exclusive to the Game Boy Color, to where I would say, like, yeah, it's more or less just backwards compatible with the Game Boy, despite having a lot in common with it. And furthermore, there was a lot of enhancements that come with it, which does play into the Pro Console idea, which is, you know, what I was really trying to get at here, because for the most part, when it comes to Pro Consoles, actually, no, like, just straight up for all Pro Consoles so far, like for the One X and the PS4 Pro, there's been no, like, exclusive games to them. Like, if it's on the One X or the Pro, it has to be on the base PS4 or VCR Xbox One, for example. But, you know, with the Game Boy Color, again, there's a bit of an argument to be made towards, like, okay, even though Nintendo said one thing, we're just gonna consider it the Game Boy 2 anyway, because it kind of was. But, again, we have to go off of what Nintendo officially says, and they say that it's part of the classic Game Boy line, so it technically is. And with that, there is a lot of Pro enhancements for a lot of games, to where if you put an original Game Boy cartridge into a Game Boy Color, you know, you're gonna get a lot of those fun enhancements, where for some games it'll just give it a light color palette. Like if you stick like Pokemon Red into a Game Boy Color, you'll get a little bit of extra color that wasn't there before. Or for some games like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, where, you know, you can put that into a Game Boy Color and it'll be all in color. And then you had a lot of games that could go back and forth, to where, you know, you could put it in the Game Boy Color and you could play it entirely in color, or you could put it in the original Game Boy and just play it on that pea green DMG screen, and, you know, you could go back and forth with it. You know, if you lived in Japan, you also had the Game Boy Light, which that was a whole conversation I had in one of my previous videos. Actually, it was in the Nintendo Light Consoles video that I talked about before, where they released the Game Boy Light in Japan, and it was the first Nintendo handheld to actually have a backlight, which, as you may or may not know, we didn't end up getting a backlight on any Nintendo handhelds until the GBA AGS 101 here in America in the mid-2000s, and at that point it was like, okay. Sega even had backlights in their handhelds back in, you know, the 90s, but, you know, Nintendo here in the 2000s, they're finally giving us backlights, and hey, you know, they'd also had, like, rechargeable batteries in the device finally, which, that was, like, the main sticking point, right? If you put a backlight in it, yeah, it's gonna suck up batteries, because that was one of the biggest complaints with the Game Gear, was like, dude, this thing, like, you're spending more on batteries than you spend on the system, which, really, objectively speaking, over time, if you use a system a lot, yeah, you're gonna end up spending more on batteries than you did on the system or whatever. Like, I think back to the Xbox 360, I ended up spending more on batteries than the controllers half the time, more, like, seriously. So that explains that, but yeah, man, having a backlight on the Game Boy Color would have been so nice, especially because, in my mind, you know, since Nintendo considers it to be part of the Game Boy family, it really was like their first Pro system. But now, between all the enhancements that you had on games that released before, then you had the exclusive games, which kind of pushes it into its own thing, but, you know, we're not going to talk about that. But yeah, you know, I would consider that to be the first official Pro console. I mean, there is also something to be said about some of the original Atari consoles, which were also, like, backwards compatible, like the Atari 7800 with 2600, which... again, though, I don't know if I could really consider that a Pro console, and again, it's not even Nintendo related, so it's not even necessarily relevant to our conversation. We're just talking about Pro consoles in general right now, though. I mean, again, though, it's not like, I don't know, that was just more or less backwards compatibility, so I don't know if I'll count that necessarily, because I wouldn't call a PS2 a PS1 Pro just because it's backwards compatible, you know what I mean? In this instance, I'm more or less talking about consoles that are just trying to iterate on a console that already exists without being an entirely new thing. Which takes us to our next point. So after the Game Boy, then obviously we had the Game Boy Advance, and after that we didn't really get anything in the way of Pro models, unless we want to do what we did with the Nintendo Switch, and where I guess we can go ahead and talk about the SP. So we had, again, like I was talking about before with the Nintendo Switch, where you have the base model, you have the Lite, and then eventually they upgraded the hardware side of things, not the specs, just like the base hardware on the outside. Gave us the OLED screen, nice kickstand, more storage, all that stuff. So, you know, in a way you could kind of call the OLED a Pro model. And they did something similar back in the 2000s with the GBA. So we had the original GBA, which, you know, was still taking double A's and all that, and, you know, still looked good, but there were still no backlights. So then a couple of years later, they released the GBA SP AGS 001, which did have a front light, you know, it was front lit, but front lit isn't the same as backlit, so, you know, it works, but the colors were still kind of dim. Depending on the lighting situations, it wasn't exactly ideal. And, you know, this was also the point where they introduced the rechargeable battery, which then also needed its own proprietary charger, and that, I feel like, could be a video on its own, talking about Nintendo's proprietary chargers, how the SP worked with the DS, and then the DS Lite needed its own charger, and only its own charger, then the DSi works with the 3DS and 2D, like, and then the styluses, don't even get me on the styluses, like how the DSi and the DS Lite and the DS and the 2DS and the 3, like, they all have, like, different stylus. It's a whole rabbit hole. So as nice as the GBA SP AGS 001 was, for the fact that we actually had some sort of light finally and a rechargeable battery, it still wasn't exactly, you know, it's just scratching that itch that we all had for a backlight. So then they introduced the AGS 101, which was finally the first official Nintendo handheld console to feature a backlight or to be lit in any substantial way outside of the Game Boy Light. But again, that was released only in Japan, so we'll count the AGS 101 as being the first official, you know, like, backlit display that was widely available in all regions and such. And yeah, it was an absolutely beautiful display, and to this day when you look at it, it looks, I mean, the GBA is just an absolutely beautiful system, between the design and, you know, the design language and the ergonomics of the system, the graphics of the games on the system. Like, there's something about the pixel art 16-bit-esque art style that a lot of the games went for on the GBA that just, I don't know, man, looking at it, it's like the Mona Lisa nowadays, you know what I mean, where you look at it, it's just like, man, this is so beautiful. You pair that up with the, you know, the backlight on the 101 to where, you know, even if you're sitting outside, you can actually see the screen or whatever, or, you know, if you're sitting in the dark, and it's just, it's an absolutely beautiful display. And there's actually a lot of people where they prefer the way that the original Game Boy Advance feels, and if I'm going to be honest, as much as I love the SP101, and that would be my go-to GBA model, if I had to pick one, the original GBA, there is something about that form factor where that's the GBA to me, you know? Like, when I think of GBA, I think of that original indigo purple model, whatever you want to call it, the more horizontal design language. But, you know, again, the SP, it's a great, comfortable system and all, but it's just, when I think GBA, that's the one I think of. But there's a lot of people that have actually taken, like, some of that, you know, modded those original Game Boy Advance models and put backlights into those. Is it relevant to our conversation? No, but I just figured I'd mention it just in case anybody out there was, you know, if you've been looking into getting a Game Boy Advance, just know that that is an option if you're like me and you kind of lean towards that original design a bit more, but you don't want to miss out on the backlight and the 101 model. Modding the system could be an option. You know, again, it would take, you would have to pull it apart and kind of do that yourself, or you could order it online, which can be a little bit more pricey. But hey, you know, when you're getting into collecting some older systems, and especially if you're trying to get into the modding side of things, and if you're really willing to do something like that, yeah, I mean, I feel like you probably had a feeling that it was going to cost you at least something in the first place, right? Outside of that, though, this was definitely a much less extreme example of a Pro console. So, you know, it isn't like any of the other Pro consoles we talked about, where even like with the Game Boy Color, you had certain enhancements. The games literally run identically on the SP, but it's very similar to the Switch OLED in the way that it's more quality of life improvements that make it more of a Pro system rather than actual spec or performance improvements in any way. Because, I mean, when it comes to performance improvements, dog, we're talking about a GBA. Do you really, like, what are you looking for here? 4K, 320 FPS? Like, come on now. Which then from there takes us up to the Nintendo DS. So then we had, you know, we have the DS and the DS Lite, which the DS Lite isn't a Pro console because it's basically the exact same as the DS. Again, there could be an argument to be made to be like, wait, Grotesque, you just counted the SP as a Pro system and the OLED as a Pro system when all they did was change up the form factor and some of the hardware and quality of life. And that's exactly what the DS Lite did, you know, giving you the option to adjust the brightness, giving it a more comfortable form factor. So why doesn't that count as a Pro console? And to be honest, it's, again, it's just one of those things where it's, hey, I'm kind of just picking and choosing here, and another reason is because the DS actually had a more valid example of a pro console, and also already made a video covering Nintendo Lite consoles, so, you know, that we already talked about the DS Lite in depth there, and again, the one that we're going to be talking about instead, which I actually have a very nice model here to kind of show an example of as we're talking about it, this more or less actually fits the criteria of the pro type consoles that we're talking about. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Japanese exclusive glossy red DSi. Now, I don't know how well the gloss is showing up on camera, but I can tell you, in person, this thing is a shining beauty. And again, you can see on the back, it's got like the Japanese letters on it because, you know, I've always said this before, where when it comes to buying my consoles and my games, I will always go for the, you know, US versions of it, and if there's no US version, then I'll go for the European version, and if there's no European version, then I'll go for the Japanese version. And that's mainly just the principle of my main language is English. I can speak a little bit of Japanese. Hajimemashite, watashi wa grotesco desu, dozo yoroshiku. Like, I can speak a little bit of Japanese, but, you know, it's obviously not my main language. I'm not exactly fluent in it. But when it comes to consoles and such, there is a lot of times where, you know, when it comes to like limited edition or certain colors, you have the US versions, you have the Japanese versions, and the Europeans. Look, I love you Europeans, you guys are great, but most you guys don't get that many limited editions compared to the US and Japan, and even if you do get them, more times than not, they're just kind of like recycled bits from what already went to the other regions. So, the DSi is one of those examples where when it comes to US system, I want to get the, like the ice blue, or not ice blue, but it's more like that. It's like the vibrant light blue, I guess more like a teal DSi at some point, but I saw this glossy red Japanese exclusive DSi and was like, hey, I've seen hundreds of those light blue DSis before, whereas I literally only seen 2 of these things before. Are they exceedingly rare? No, but they are also Japanese exclusive, so I was like, hey, this one's in literally perfect condition, the screens, the console, everything was in perfect condition, got a great price on it, snagged it, and yeah, so basically the DSi, this was Nintendo's pro console during the DS generation. Also, if you're curious for any reason, the DSi is kind of not region locked, so if you're interested in getting a, you know, like Japanese only color like this, especially like this glossy red, because there was a glossy red and a matte red, so do not get swindled. If you're looking for the nice glossy red like this, make sure you look up glossy, make sure it is glossy. If you want the matte, go for the matte, either way. People complain about fingerprint magnets, you know, when it comes to like glossy devices, and while there is a case to be made about that, for this red one specifically, it isn't glossy enough to where it's actually a fingerprint magnet, so, you know, if you want this color, I could recommend going for it, because there's barely like any noticeable scratches or fingerprints on this thing, and it literally just, I mean, it's just a beautiful device. Anyway, I forgot if I actually mentioned it or not. I was about to mention it before I probably cut myself off, but the DSi is and kind of isn't region locked, so you can play most DS games on it, but there will be, for like some of the DSi exclusive games, you have to look at like the, what's it called, like the serial number on it. If it says NTR on the game, you can run it. If it says TWL, you're gonna need the Japanese version. However, if you mod the system, which I would recommend doing, you know, especially, you know, if you do end up picking up a Japanese system specifically, I would recommend modding it so then you can run everything in English, because otherwise you cannot change the language on it without modding it. So when I first got the system, I had to hold up a camera with Google Translate to navigate the system a bit, but then I got it modded and, you know, just, you know, change the language so then I could actually read it a bit more, because while I can read some Japanese, I'm kind of limited to only hiragana, so I can only read bits and pieces here, and then when it comes to the katakana and kanji in it, I was kind of getting lost because I only know a little bit of kanji. But otherwise, the DSi was Nintendo's, you know, pro console for the DS generation. Again, we had the DS and the DS Lite before this, but the DSi was almost like an entirely new system, akin to something like the Game Boy Color, where it's like, okay, for a moment you could almost argue that maybe it was almost its own thing because they had exclusive games for it, but Nintendo seems to handle their pro consoles differently than the other manufacturers, because again, if a game goes to the One X or the PS4 Pro, it's gonna go to the base consoles. But for Nintendo's pro consoles, as we have already talked about, the SP being the only exception, since that wasn't really a pro console in the same way, it was just more or less hardware revisions. With the Game Boy Color, there was a lot of exclusive games to it, to the point where it felt like a successor to the Game Boy. And then the DSi, you had DSi Where? You had the you know, like 3 physical DSi exclusive games, you know, with System Flaw, Photo Showdown, and the Hair Salon game. And then you had all the DSiWare, which there is a case to be made that a lot of the DSiWare games were technically just stripped down versions of pre-existing DS games, but there was still a lot of original games there, like Shantae is one of the go-to standouts there, obviously, of DSiWare. So in one aspect, yeah, you know, it's following the philosophy of previous and future Nintendo Pro consoles or handheld consoles that we're going to be talking about, where there is some exclusive games on it, but for the most part, it's basically within the same family. It's considered to be within the same family and is a part of the same generation. It's just a slight upgrade in terms of software, hardware, etc. So when it came to the original DS Lite, obviously there wasn't much of a OS on the system, right? Yeah, I mean there was obviously. I mean every piece of software, or every piece of hardware needs software like a OS to work and get you from point A to point B. Like when you turn on the system and it says Nintendo DS and you have all your options there, that is the operating system. That is you know what lets you operate the system per se. You know what I mean? So you know there is an OS. It's rather light on the DS and the DS Lite. Get it? Anyway. But in the DSi, we actually got a bit of actual software where it felt very Wii-like, if you want to put it that way, where you had a lot of these channel-looking boxes. Again, obviously it wasn't going for the same Wii channel language, but it was going for a very similar boxy language where you navigate between the different boxes. It takes you from your home screen to your camera to your recordings to your microphone to your game, and you know it's a very nice, you know, in and out type of thing, very much akin to the Wii. You point the remote, you click on one channel, you go to the next Wii channel, you edit your Mii's, you go to your weather, your settings, whatever. Same thing on the DS. You just kind of go between these things, and it's very fast, it's very fluent. And furthermore, this was one of their first official Pro consoles in the way that there was actual improvements to the specs. You know, in terms of what games actually took advantage of that, it wasn't very many. I mean, there is a list of like DSi enhanced games out there where they'll utilize certain features of the system, because that is also worth mentioning, where we did have new features introduced here in the system, like we have a camera on the back as well as on the front, so you could use that, and then, you know, like certain other features like the voice recordings and stuff like that. Again, we kind of already had voice recordings on the DS Lite, but it was more or less just voice recognition rather than full-on recordings like you could here, and again, you had like the cameras and all that. So, yeah, you know, there was a lot of enhancements made not only to the hardware inside of the system, but also it was just like an entirely new revision without being an entirely new device. And again, we had some games that were enhanced for the DSi, whether that be certain features where you could take pictures of yourself and put yourself inside of the game, or other features just like slightly boosted performance. In terms of everything else, the screens were only slightly bigger, so the DS and the DS Lite had 3-inch screens on the top and bottom, whereas the DSi has 3.25-inch screens on the top and bottom. The resolution was the exact same, so the games are going to look basically identical, just on a slightly bigger scale or on a slightly bigger screen than on the original DS. But thankfully, it's not too big to the point of where it looks like blown out or blurry. I mean, even on the DSi XL, even though that screen is substantially larger, almost 2 inches larger, the screens don't look, you know, like blown out or blurry, like even with the same resolution, because the XL has the same resolution as even the original DS and DS Lite. You know, the games still look absolutely beautiful, and I feel like that also just kind of feeds into the fact that a lot of the games during the DS, and that also goes back to what I was saying about the GBA, where a lot of the games on the DS just look absolutely beautiful. Even the games that were going for more of like a 3D aesthetic, like it sort of has like that low poly PS1, N64 look, so those look beautiful. But then you also have a lot of beautiful 2D games with more of that like pixel art style. Like the first one that comes to my mind is like the Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith tie-in game, which had more of a pixel art style. Or Kirby Squeak Squad is another one that looks great with that more cartoonish pixely art style. So even on an XL, it still looks really good. And just I don't know, there's just, again, something about those games with that art style where it's like, man, it's like the modern day Mona Lisa looking at those beauties, you know what I mean? The DSi is also where they finally introduce a more uniform, universal charger port that they would use going forward. So the charger for the DSi works on the 3DS and the 2DS and all those other systems, so that is very nice, because again, before this, we had the SP charger, which worked with the DS, but that didn't work with the DS Lite. The DS Lite has its own charger that only works with it. And then the DSi, XL, 3DS, and the 2DS and all those systems finally, again, share like the same charger there. And otherwise, outside of that I feel like that mostly covers the DSi. Again, we got way more colors with this thing. You know, there was a lot of special variations. I want to get my hands on that light blue one we were talking about, as well as the lime green looking one. I don't know. I've never really owned any green systems, now that I'm thinking of it, but I don't know. That one just kind of appealed to me. I saw it on eBay. I was like, man, that's a really nice color, and I remember seeing it a couple of years ago, so thinking about that. Might pick that one up at some point, but otherwise I feel like that covers most of our bases with the DSi there, right? We cover the exclusive games and some of the performance boosts and such, so really when it comes to the original DS, you can't go wrong with any model. If you want to get like the most games, technically speaking, you probably want to go with the DSi. Maybe, you know, if you want to go bang for buck, get a Japanese DSi, mod it to display in English, and then, you know, the possibilities are limitless there between playing original DS games. Obviously, it also supports original DS cartridges, as well as playing DSiWare and such. But it is also worth mentioning that while this is a Pro-type system, the one disadvantage is that the original DS and DS Lite could play Game Boy Advance cartridges natively, whereas the DSi doesn't have a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot. Kind of sucks, I know, which also makes it so that certain games like Guitar Hero, you simply can't even play on the DSi because you need the GBA, you know, slot there to play it. But again, the slot isn't there, so you know, for certain games that need attachments like that, which was like less than 10, you won't be able to play those on the DSi. But you know, very niche scenario. So if you want to cover all your bases, maybe just pick up a DSi, and you know, go ahead and pick up a 3DS while you're at it, because we're about to talk about that next. But finally, that leaves us with the new Nintendo 3DS, 3DS XL, and 2DS XL. Now, I've always kind of been like, Nintendo, why do you do this? Because they called New Super Mario Bros. In 2005 New Super Mario Bros. But now it's 2024 and that game is almost 19 years old, actually going on 20 years next year, so it's like, how new is it now? But I don't want to sound like a broken record at this point, so really everything that I said about the DSi really does apply to the new Nintendo 3DS and XL and 2DS XL, so we'll just kind of break this down, go bit by bit. So when you look at the original 3DS, it kind of looks like a layer cake, you know what I mean? I don't know how else to explain it. It's sort of like a PS4 in the way that you got all these like different layers to it. It's a great looking system, but you know, there were some complaints that it's a little top heavy. The 3D wasn't exactly perfect. The 3DS XL even had its own growing pains with a more plasticky, slightly cheaper-ish feel. I never thought that was an issue. I never thought it really felt cheap, but some people just thought that it felt a bit less premium than the original 3DS, which, you know, I mean, I could see that. So then, moving into the new Nintendo 3DS, before that we also had the 2DS, which I also talked about in my Nintendo Lite consoles video, where it was sort of like the light version of the Nintendo 3DS, if you want to say that, because obviously for the DS we had a more apt light console with the DS Lite, but for the 3DS we never got that 3DS Lite until, you know, unless you want to count the 2DS, which I was saying, hey, maybe we could count that, even though it is kind of its own thing, so you kind of had that. And otherwise, yeah, you know, there were some, you know, some things that could be said about each system. Obviously the 2DS only plays games in 2D, but I mean, if you're buying the 2DS, I feel like, you know, that shouldn't really matter. Like, if you know what you're getting into. The 3DS XL, some people just weren't, it's just something about the, I guess, the slightly cheaper feel of it they weren't really jiving with. But for the most part, most people kind of flocked towards that system. And then the original one, again, the growing pains with the 3D, which also carried over to the XL, and overall just being a little top heavy and maybe just needing some work in that department. So then we enter the new Nintendo 3DS family of systems. So first, we look at the new Nintendo 3DS, the base system, and it's essentially the same size as the original 3DS, except it's just kind of like a slimmed down version of it, you know, and the 3D has been vastly improved, which also applies to the new Nintendo 3DS XL, to where the camera will actually track your face while you're using the system. So rather than if you know, slightly move your head, the 3D goes all wonky and it's basically like a blurry mess. You can, you know, you can move all around. You don't have to just be looking at it dead on. You can move all around. The 3D will still be perfect, and it's awesome. And then they also gave a C-Stick to the system finally, which was a highly requested feature, because you had games like, you know, like Splinter Cell and Metal Gear Solid and Kid Icarus Uprising, where they obviously, you know, vastly benefited from having the Circle Pad Pro attachment that Nintendo released to kind of shush the people that were asking for a second analog stick, because there were a lot of people like, hey, you know, Nintendo, we love the 3DS, but if you could just, you know, there's like all this space on the second and on the right side of the system, if you could just put like a thumb pad there so we had a second stick, I mean, that would be great. If the PS Vita can do it, why can't the 3DS do it? So then Nintendo was like, all right, fine. Then they put out the Circle Pad Pro attachment, which basically you put your 3DS inside of this thing, and it has a second circle pad on the side next to the buttons. So you have the normal 3DS, and then on the it's sort of like putting the Wiimote into a Wii Zapper. You know what I mean? That's sort of what it's like, except it has more functionality, because it's not just a piece of plastic, and it actually does add some functionality to the system. But yeah, you have that on the side, so you know, Like, yeah, sure, it works. If you're really that desperate, you could get it, but it obviously wasn't the most ideal solution. So then by the time the new Nintendo 3DS and XL and 2DS XL came out, they finally gave us a natural C-stick or second stick. It's not really a stick, it's more or less just like a touch-sensitive nub that kind of detects where your finger is going. Again, with the original 3DS, me personally, I always found the controls in games like Kid Icarus Uprising and Metal Gear Solid, like we had talked about, to be, you know, intuitive for the system. I'm also the same guy that enjoyed playing first-person shooters on the original DS, so, you know, I was just kind of used to those controls where you hold the system and you use the thumbstick and kind of like, you know, just, yeah, I don't know, you kind of get used to it if you've played a lot of shooters or games that rely on that kind of touch control. But for people that aren't used to it, I can understand why maybe they needed that stand that came with Kid Icarus Uprising to hold up the 3DS to play for long sessions, or why they weren't able to get used to the controls. Because, yeah, you know, if you're not used to that, if you haven't played a lot of games like that, might take some time for you to adjust to it. Again, for somebody like me, I've played a lot of games like that, so it's very natural to me. But again, for the general population, general consumer, I can understand it, just having a second stick there. I'm not saying I'm opposed to it, because, I mean, yeah, you know, it's nice having it there, and it does open up the gateways for possibilities, especially if there's, you know, people with disabilities where, like, maybe they aren't able to, you know, do that whole setup with the stylus and that. You know, maybe it's easier for them to just use the C-stick and the, you know, circle pad, so that's awesome. So they included that with the system. They also added in a NFC reader to the bottom screen, so that was around the time that Amiibo, where, you know, Nintendo was, like, all in on Amiibo at that point, so you could just, you know, scan the thing on the bottom screen. The bottom screen had built-in NFC reader, because before that, if you wanted to do that on 3DS, you had to have a separate NFC reader. So again, that was finally native in the system. And similar to the DSi, we also had a bit of a spec bump. So it had a faster CPU, which not only allowed for there to be some exclusive games, which we talked about with all the previous Nintendo Pro systems, Pro handhelds, where, you know, they're not entirely new systems. They're going to be running the exact same games as the, you know, handhelds that came before within that same generation, and they're going to be considered to be part of that same generation. But they are going to have a few exclusive games just to kind of be like, hey, you know, you want to pick up the system. So they had 5 exclusive retail new Nintendo 3DS games. There was also a bunch of like eShop ones as well. But those games were Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, Minecraft New Nintendo 3DS Edition, Fire Emblem Warriors, and Runbow Pocket Deluxe. So again, like I said, there was only like 4 exclusive physical games for the system. I might have misspoke and said 5. I'm recording this at like 7 a.m. Please forgive me. But yeah, you know, there was 4 exclusive physical games for the system. And, you know, again, we did have some exclusive eShop games, but in terms of just like physical games, yeah, that was that. You know, for the eShop ones though, they were, you know, pretty substantial titles, like The Binding of Isaac, for example, that was on there. Don't understand why that couldn't run on an original 3DS, but, you know, I feel like with enough downscaling, they could have made that work. But, you know, still, that's an exclusive to the new Nintendo 3DS family of systems. Sorry, I've been recording for a while. My speech is starting to fail me a bit. But then we also had a bunch of enhancements to previous games, which is similar to what I was talking about with the DSi, where whether that be certain features, which the feature side of things wasn't exactly utilized as much. It was more or less just usually down to, hey, this game has better performance. One of the main ones that I always point to being Hyrule Warriors on the new Nintendo 3DS. It was very playable on the original 3DS and 2DS, for example, but if you played on the new Nintendo 3DS systems, you're gonna have, you know, just like a slightly higher frame rate, more persistent performance, and outside of that, that's kind of where the differences lie. Again, there was a few exclusive games to the new Nintendo 3DS systems, and otherwise, for the most part, you know, the OS is gonna be a bit snappier when you're navigating the menus. Some of the games are going to run a bit faster. They're going to load a bit faster too. But otherwise, they're pretty identical to the original family of systems. And if you're going to pick up any Nintendo 3DS, you know, obviously, I would say that the new Nintendo 3DS systems, whether that be the 3DS, the 3DS XL, or the new Nintendo 2DS XL, are the definitive systems. They're also getting up there in price just because they are the definitive systems. So really, if you want my true advice, if you're trying to just save some money or just get into the 3DS family of systems without breaking the bank, get a 3DS, 3DS XL, or even a 2DS, which honestly, I'm not gonna lie, nowadays the 2DS is the one that I play the most. Yeah, you know, just go for one of those systems, you'll save a lot of money, and you know, it's still moddable, just the same as the new systems, and you're only gonna be missing out on those 4 games, and while those 4 games are rather substantial and are worth playing and experiencing and are rather mind-blowing to see running on the system, especially like Xenoblade Chronicles 3D, where that's truly like a jaw-dropping moment seeing that run on a 3DS, you know, there is ways to emulate those games, and while emulating isn't necessarily the most ideal situation situation in the world. It again just comes down to, hey, how much are you willing to break the bank to experience these games? If you're willing to go all out and break the bank, which I can completely understand as a collector, because I myself do not have a new 3DS system yet, but I do plan to get one eventually. I want to get the default size, just normal new 3DS. The XL systems are just a bit too big for me, but I do want to get one of those default new 3DS systems at some point. I totally understand where you're coming from if that's what you're saying. So, you know, if you're willing to spend a bit more, those would be the systems to get. But if you're just trying to get in, I would say probably go for the 2DS. That's probably the cheapest model, either that or the original 3DS. The 3DS XL is even starting to get up there in price, so I'd probably either go for the original 3DS or the 2DS. You know, if your eye, because for me, I can't really do 3D anyway. It just kind of messes with my eyes, makes me feel a little sick. But, you know, if you want to experience that for the first time, if you never experienced 3D, I could probably recommend picking up an original 3DS, just so you can at least experience it. Play a game like Super Mario 3D Land on there. That's one of my favorite go-to examples of a game that really utilizes 3D well and makes you realize just like how limitless 3D really is, or like just how much potential is there for playing games in 3D. And it's really a shame that nobody else in the gaming industry really did anything with 3D after that. Like, even Nintendo themselves started to kind of drop support for 3D as the system went on, and the closest we've gotten to that since then is VR, but obviously VR is like a whole different thing. But, you know, playing some of those levels in Super Mario 3D Land or just some of the other games on 3DS, it's like truly just, it's a mind-blowing experience. So again, if you never experienced a 3DS like that, I could probably recommend that model, but either way, you can't go wrong with any of the systems. You know, the 3DS has an amazing library of games. There's thousands of games to play, not to mention the fact that it's also backwards compatible with original DS games as well, so, you know, you're gonna get a lot there. It can also play DSiWare games, so if you're looking for the ultimate DS system, the ultimate one would be a new Nintendo 3DS system, but if you're just looking for a general ultimate system that can play 2DS or 3DS, DS, and DSi games, go with a, you know, one of the 3DS systems. And then obviously once you mod it, then that opens the door for emulation. There's ways to play Game Boy Advance and Game Boy games on there, and like Neo Geo Pocket. If you can put like Atari stuff on there, which works really well because you have the circle pad for the full 360 degrees of movement. So the possibilities are truly endless there. But I feel like that covers everything with the new Nintendo 3DS systems, right? Did I get to talk about the 2DS XL yet? No, I did not. Okay, so again, they fixed the 3D on the new 3DS and the new 3DS XL. But for the 2DS XL, rather than doing what they did before, where, you know, the 2DS was obviously more of just like a slab system with no hinges, the 2DS XL, rather than just making the 2DS bigger, they made it the exact same as any other DS, where it's like a clamshell design, which kind of takes away from the whole 2D point of it, because I thought part of the 2D name was the fact that the system itself is 2D, which I felt like kind of played into the nice design language of it, but whatever. And then, yeah, there was no 3D on the system, obviously. It was a clamshell design, it was a bit bigger, but otherwise it runs the exact same games as the new 3DS systems can, you know, even the exclusive ones. It just can't do 3D, so, you know, there's that as well. It's literally the exact same on the inside, it's just there's no 3D, it's a bit bigger, and it's in a clamshell now for some reason. I really wish they would have just done the original design but bigger, but I don't know, maybe that's just me. But anyway, I feel like now we've covered all our bases. I know this video was really rambly. I know we've been sitting here talking for a while, but if you're new to these kind of videos or just new to my channel, that's what I like to do. I like to find a topic that interests me, but nobody else has either thought about or just simply doesn't care about. And, you know, just, again, it's a situation where nobody else would ever think about this stuff or really even care about it in the first place anyway, but, or, yeah, I mean, if you're watching this far, I feel like you probably at least care about it, but you probably wouldn't have thought of this, at least, you know, very specific discussion before of Nintendo Pro consoles. So this is the stuff with my crazy ADHD, OCD mind just kind of floating around where it's like, hey, this is a topic that interests me, so I just like to sit down, talk with you guys, and hopefully make it interesting for you, and just gives you a peek into what goes through my mind when I'm trying to sleep at night, you know what I mean? But anyways, yeah, I have a lot of ideas for other videos I want to do like this, and I've already made several videos like this before. I really need to make a playlist for these videos, so I'll get around to doing that at some point. But yeah, that was the history of Nintendo Pro consoles and more or less handhelds, because that was one point I wanted to touch on. The other, you know, for the other manufacturers, you know, the One X and the PS4 Pro, like we talked about before, they always do consoles. Nintendo, they never do Pro consoles. They just do Pro handhelds, as you can see from the discussion we had. All their console revisions, the Switch OLED, stuff like the Wii Mini, which, oh gosh, I don't know, we're not even going to talk about that right now. That's just a whole stripped down Wii situation. They haven't really done Pro consoles unless you want to count the expansion pack and the N64, but that's an accessory, not a whole new system. So really, the only time they've done Pro consoles in its truest form with upgraded specs has been in their handhelds. But again, I've been babbling for long enough. I could keep going, but you know, I don't want to eat up all your time now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this very long, verbose, and in-depth discussion with me about Nintendo's Pro consoles and handhelds. But anyway, as always, massive shout out thanking all the patrons and channel members, thanking on the low ball tier, and shout out thanking on the big ball tier, my last game is anime and the big shut on GT run events, and let's just go. Thank you guys so much, you guys are literal legends. I love you. Goron ni to toki irigito, because I miss. Have an amazing day, stay beautiful, I love you all. Peace.